Morning everyone, so this is my second video for Eduqas English Language Component 1, Section A, the reading section. My last video looked at questions 1 and 2. This video is looking at questions 3 and 4. If you're sitting this paper in 2025, then this is a reminder that it is Friday the 23rd of May and you've got an hour and 45 minutes. If you're not sure about how to spend those that time, go and look at my first video because that breaks the timings down for you. All right, so very important reminders before we get into how to answer these questions. Questions 2, 3 and 4. So I've already dealt with question 2, but it's the same mark scheme. Questions 2, 3 and 4 are all assessed for AO2. AO2 is your understanding of how language used and how the writer creates meaning. And it's really important that you keep hold of that idea. How is the writer creating meaning? So underneath each section, you will often see an instruction that says something like you must refer to language and you need to use relevant subject terminology. And that is often misunderstood, particularly if you've been watching videos that are not specifically for Eduqas, where students on other exam boards do have to analyse techniques in English language. Eduqas don't ask you to do that. They are very focused on you showing your understanding of a text, not analysing it. So when it says refer to the language used, it literally just means use quotes in your answer. Relevant subject terminology does not mean things like nouns, verbs, personifications, simile, metaphor. Okay, what does that mean then? So Eduqas are interested in the subject terms that deal with the whole of the text that you're reading, not the individual words in sentences. So they want you to talk about things like the narrator and the narrator's voice, how characters are developed and what's happening with the action, the contrasts, the climax, the resolution. Okay, it is not interested in whether you can spot a simile. They are assessing the fact that you can read the text carefully, understand it, think about it, what is happening and what that implies. So to be really clear, for English language, you are not expected to identify word types at all. You are expected to talk about the things that deal with the whole text. All right, now let's have a look at questions 3 and 4. So the sentence stems can vary and you've got a collection of them that you can see on the screen there. You don't need to worry too much about how the sentence is set up. You need to find the question focus for those specific lines and follow the same method for every single question. And as you'll see in a minute, it's very similar to the method that I've talked to you about for question 2. So they might use a variety of questions. And obviously, if it asks you to talk about thoughts and feelings, talk about thoughts and feelings of a particular character. If it asks you to talk about a relationship, talk about the relationship, but don't worry about whether it is a what or a how question, whether it says how does the writer present or what does the writer show. You are using the same methods and this is the exam method, and like I've said, it's the same method as question 2. So you're going to box out the lines, track through the lines in order, highlighting any details that are relevant to the question focus. You're going to identify 7 to 8, remember this is a 10-mark question, 7 to 8 valid inferences with evidence, and you're going to write those up as inferences with evidence. You don't need more than 8, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but you do need them to be valid and accurate. So it's more important that you are getting your valid and accurate inferences and evidence, not that you've got all 8 of them. Okay, so some of those inferences will be really simple. Some of them will be more complex, and it's the complexity of your inferences that's going to help you get up to 10 marks. Let's take a little time out. Remember, if you are aiming for a grade 4 or 5, you do not need to do the work that I am about to go through, where you could be getting marks that are 7+ out of 10. You don't need all 7. If you are someone, and this is where we need to make sure we're really aware of what we're aiming for, if you are someone that's aiming for a passing grade, grade 4, or slightly higher than that, grade 5, you should be focusing on simply getting the 4 or 5 accurate and valid inferences. And I'll show you what that looks like, because we're going to talk about the difference between simple inferences and complex ones. So this answer is the sort of bit by bit answer. And what this answer is where a candidate has gone through the lines that they've been given, line by line, identifying the evidence that they want to talk about, and then they write those up, evidence, inference, or inference, evidence, and they get to about 6 or 7. And this is absolutely fine. As long as your inferences are valid and accurate, you can get to about 6 or 7 out of 10, as long as you have those valid things to say. So let's have a look at this example. Steve is tall, he towered over everyone. So that would be our first mark. The evidence is that he towered over everyone. The inference is that he's tall. And then the next one is kind of totally it's, you know, you can see it comes from the next section, the next line. We learn that Steve gets angry a lot. Shouting was his hobby. Then Steve doesn't help at home. He was at the pub to avoid helping with homework. And so you could see that if this person had written 6 or 7 of those, they're all unconnected from one another and they are valid, and you can get about 6 or 7 out of 10 for that. If you are someone that's aiming for a grade 4 or 5, you don't even need to do that many. You can get to about 4 or 5 evidence plus inference, and you're doing absolutely fine. You then want to move on to the next question. If, however, you are aiming for higher marks, then you're going to want a more cohesive answer. So in your little inference explanations, you are trying to identify how the writer develops an idea or shows a particular change. So remember, we're imagining that this question is about Steve's character, like what impressions do you get about Steve's character, or whatever that is. And a more cohesive answer would be using the same information that we had in the previous bit by bit answer. Steve is tall. He towered over everyone. The writer reinforces, or the writer develops, or the writer continues the idea that Steve might be intimidating when we learn he gets angry a lot. Shouting was his hobby. And so the difference between this answer, which if it did that a couple of times would take it up to higher than 7 out of 10. The difference between this answer is that the comments now link together. They recognise that in the chunk of passage that the exam board has given you, the writer has made some choices to create an overall idea about the character. And so it's not just like bullet point, they're somewhat disconnected, but they're still valid. This is showing a cohesive idea of what the writer is doing. So how would you be setting this up? You could be saying things like the writer reinforces, develops, continues. The writer contrasts this. Overall, the question focus, so Steve seems. You're making explicit choices about the comments about what the writer has chosen to do, not comments about the language in the particular evidence that you've used, but how the evidence develops what we learn about the character or the situation or the relationship or the event. So how does it develop? How does it change over that short passage? All right, let's very quickly, just to have a reminder of the exam method. So you are going through line by line, highlighting anything relevant to the question focus. You're identifying those 7 to 8 valid inferences with evidence, and you're going to write them up as your inference plus evidence sentences. They don't need to have long explanations. But if you are aiming for that higher grade, that higher mark out of 10, then you are going to have a look at, see if you can make some comments on the writer's choices. Those will be just very short additions to your sentences, and that is how you tackle questions 3 and 4. My next video is on question 5, very similar, just dealing with the evaluation element of that question.